Stop the Week with Robert Robinson. Hello. Our conversation this evening comes from Sarah Harrison, the only civilian present. All the others are foot soldiers in the groves of academe. They are Adrian Furnham, lecturer in psychology at University College London, Laurie Taylor, Professor of Sociology at York University, and Nicholas Tucker, lecturer in psychology at Sussex University. But apart from all that, I'm very pleased to say the music is from Jeremy Nicholas. Mispronunciations aren't half as attractive as mispronunciations that amount to new coinages. I was listening to the PM programme on Wednesday evening, and their reporter, Kent Barker, whose eager-eyed style and strip cartoon name makes me think of Tinker, Sexton Blake's apprentice. Anyway, Kent came out with a wonderful new word when telling us about the America's Cup, an event I bewilderedly persist in feeling I'd never heard of. In speaking of the captain of the losing boat, Kent spoke of his attitude to the winner. He was, said Kent, very magnanimous. Now, I suspect that the word ignominious had been working its way around Kent's neural pathways, because, you know, if you've lost a race or something, you might feel a bit on the ignominious side, and I think he allowed this to invade magnanimous, and so produced magnanimous, which once heard is not easily forgotten, but these new coinages don't get into the public domain as often as they ought to. They stay as family treasures. I know in my own kitchen there are no such things as ingredients, only ingrediments. You must have similar experiences.
My brother, I think it was, invented something called lumpy vap. Now, lumpy vap, of course, was cream with evaporated milk poured into the cream, so that lumpy vap then became like a generic term for this.
The charm of them is that they're extremely specific, aren't they, these newly coined words? I mean, we have one, garking, which is the sound a baby makes when it's getting fractious but not actually bawling. Squinch, which is what you experience when you're brushing tangled wet hair. Discombobulate, to inconvenience and confuse at the same time.
Oh, but that's widespread, discombobulate.
Oh, is it?
It's an Americanism.
Words which evolve by a process of ellipsis, like scrote, as in my evening scrote, or look at those old scrotes. Hornicles for specks.
Awful,
it is awful, yes, from the Spoonerism speck-rimmed hornicles. But I must draw to your attention 3 terms coined by an old regimental chum of my father's in India, for which you will at once see the necessity in everyday discourse, and I make no apology for the vaguely sort of pig-sticking motif which runs through them. First of all, there's a woofador. Now, this is a gentleman employed by heads of state in the great days of empire, whose job it was to move discreetly behind the rows of elephants and persuade them to raise their trunks in salute. A woofador. A bummertoot, an employee of the railways, usually recruited from the ranks of out-of-work acrobats, whose task was to prevent people, by whatever means, from using the lavatory when the train was standing in the station. A newt is a man who makes nivets, and what I hear you cry is a nivet.
What is a nivet?
Why, a minute conical peg for inserting into the backside of the housefly to stop him defecating on the sugar. And so it goes on. As you can see, these words, we need them.
Well, I'll tell you, my friend Kev, he does something else now, but he used to be an announcer, and he invented a wonderful character. He coined the character the Char actor, and as he pointed out afterwards, it was always the youngest member of a repertory company, the gopher, but he would bring the tea, hence the Char, you see, the Char actor, and as well known to actors as Walter Plinge. You put the name in when you're playing 2 parts, and one of them has to be Walter Plinge. But in fact, the Char actor's genesis was due to the typewriter which had printed out the news for Kev to read, and it had produced, out of the word character, 2 words, Char actor. And he saw the 2 words and he read them out to the listening millions, and a mythological figure was born, and we're all the better for the Char actor.
I think that we can accept stories like that much more easily than anything to do with family words. however brilliant family words are, and I think there's some very good ones, they have an enormous handicap that they're exclusive, and they're very often used by novelists like Angus Wilson or playwrights like Noel Coward to sort of get across the idea of a most awful, incestuous, spoilt and conceited type of family. And I think if it wasn't for this prejudice we have against these words that actually keep us out, we could in fact welcome far more of them into the language.
Well, they're also a bit coy.
Nothing is more infuriating to the child than to have those repeated back to it later on. I mean, I can remember delightedly telling my son only a few years ago, I was saying, well, I must go and get a new bulb for the kitchen. I know, I said, smiling eagerly at him, I'll go to Woobits, because Woobits was the generic term that used for Woolworths and all other shops, so we would go out to Woobits. And I can remember the look on his face, how dare I laugh at him not being able to speak properly when he was young.
Bosking is rather good. It's a basking in the shade. It was once used in a nature notebook by a child. It's basking, but in a sort of shady corner. Bosking,
The other thing is the abbreviations, isn't it? Because because the families, one word carries enormous potency. I mean, the word all through my childhood was foxing, just this simple one word, because it meant that someone was pretending to be ill in order they didn't have to go to school. And as there were 3 other children, people would come down and I'd go, foxing, not foxing, foxing, not foxing, every morning for years and years.
Very worrying word is undurfed. There was a friend of a daughter of mine, and you know how feverish the atmosphere of an examination is, and the question was, define fully the word undurfed. And it was only when she came out, you know, she realised it was underfed and undurfed. But enough of all this, I think we'll go on, because I want to tell you about this parade of shops in East Molesey, whose windows are large and wide. And my old friend and I were walking past them when I noticed he was glancing sideways and taking advantage of their wonderfully reflective quality to tug his coat down, smooth his hair and pull his stomach in. As for me, I caught one glimpse of the heap of slurry I took to be myself and looked hastily away. In that moment, I thought, behold, another of those great divides which call for urgent discussion. The mirror as an irresistible magnet to some, an aversion to others. What strange ambiguities lie between those two extremes?
I think you have to decide, first of all, exactly how much you resemble the person in the mirror. And I think that really it isn't a question. I mean, the idea that one person who looks in the mirror is more vain than someone else. I was looking today at some pictures of people, some old pictures and pictures several hundred years old of people looking in the mirror. Now, when you look at those pictures, they nearly all have the same look on their face, and the look on their face is a mixture. It's a disgruntled pleasure is the only way. It's like it is me. It's the pleasure of recognition, but the disappointment at what is being recognised. And I think that you always notice when babies, I think, when they start to grow up, there's about sort of 50 weeks or something like that. Probably plenty of psychologists here to confirm this or not. That they start when they're shown a mirror, they start kissing it. That they actually sort of kiss the little reflection in the mirror. And I think that later on, that any such adoring of the mirror isn't an adoring of oneself. It's an adoring of the person who has come to be in the mirror over that period of time. I don't spend my time.
Interesting bit of smoke you were laying down.
But there is always just one little tiny thing about the reflection that you see in the mirror which doesn't strike you as being like yourself. My reflection, for example, always seems much more miserable than I fancy myself to be. And when I was checking up to see, when I looked in the mirror...
the way you catch yourself for a very minor peccadillo.
It's a very minor peccadillo, but I notice that whenever I look in the mirror, it's always to try to pull a more cheerful face just before I set off to go out.
Well, I think that gives it away, you see, Laurie. I think you look in the mirror not to see who you are, but to, in a sense, to see who you aren't. Because looking back at you is somebody, for example, with their parting on the wrong side, is somebody who's full face, who doesn't possess a profile, is somebody who's not talking, which, dare I say, for you and perhaps some of us here, is a very untypical way in which to look. So you're not looking at yourself. You're looking at the beginning.
If you're talking to
you're looking at the beginnings of yourself.
You as a psychologist.
And you're then wondering, what's this going to turn into? What does it look like when it's not looking in the mirror?
And that's isn't that the paradox, that one looks in the mirror, in a sense, to get some objective view. Other people tell you that you look good or you look bad, or you see photographs of yourself, but you go into the mirror when somebody says you look very good or you look rather ill today, to check that this is the objective view. And of course, as Nicholas said, it's not the objective view because it's the mirror image. That is why we don't like photographs of ourselves. That's why some people, in fact, send back paintings, because they've been shown the real them, the mirror reversed once again, as it were. And we're not used to seeing that. So the paradox is one goes to the mirror for objectivity and doesn't get it.
Right.
Yes, I think it's much more than this. I think we actually subconsciously, I shouldn't say that in this company, but I think
what
we
else can
actually
you say in this
believe
company?
in that, and perhaps I should. We actually believe that there is another mirror world. Alice through the looking glass, the Lady of Shalott, the wicked stepmother and her magic mirror that talk back. I just feel it's curious, isn't it, that you can always tell when someone's looking in a mirror. You notice with those pop stars who've never been on top of the pops before, you can tell when they're looking in the monitor. And it's the same when you can tell when somebody's catching their eye in the mirror. And have you never, as a child, turned away from the mirror and looked back quickly to see if the reflection was doing something else?
What of that startling moment, if you remember it, when you discover you actually had sides to your head?
Yes.
When you put your head forward into your mother's dressing table, which had three mirror leaves to it, and you got used to the front bit, and you'd sort of say, who's that?
That's
how
right.
strange,
And
how
isn't
peculiar.
one's back disappointing? I mean,
Yes.
when you are buying clothes and they say, right, and you turn round and you suddenly see your back. Now, that is something that is extremely difficult to recognise. You think that somebody else has arrived. The back of me looks disappointingly, I mean, you can tell me about the front, but the back of me looks disappointingly slovenly.
I would like to have
But
two
very-
bags. My back looks beautiful to me and much superior to my front, and if I could be given two bags, I'd have
You
them.
can have mine any day.
Laurie, why stop at the back? I mean,
Thank you very much.
I must say this, that one of the greatest shocks any of us can have is walking down the street and seeing somebody come towards us who looks only vaguely familiar, and we look again, it's ourselves in a mirror that we didn't know was there. That the whole business of looking in the mirror is you're getting ready before you see yourself what you actually want to see. Seeing it without wanting to is a very different matter. And I just want to say something else, what Sarah said, this business about what's going on in the mirror. I'm very struck that whenever I see a horror film, there's always a moment when somebody looks in the mirror and then you say, Mike, for God's sake, whenever you're in a horror film, don't do that. Because either somebody will come from the back, or else, even worse, suddenly the room will change. It'll be a different room altogether. And I think part of looking at the mirror is like pinching yourself if you're still existing. Will it still actually be there, the same as when you looked last time?
The worrying thing is to wonder if you actually are existing before you look in the mirror. And I think one of the things, I'm sorry about these childhood epiphanies that I'm wheeling out, but I mean, it's the presence of all the psychologists, I suppose. But I do remember age 11 looking in the mirror where the coats were hanging in the hall and suddenly realising I was a separate person. And I tell you, it was very frightening. I must have assumed I was a simple function of my environment before then, of my mum and dad, the home and school and friends and so on. And I suddenly saw myself and I thought I was alone. And what really worried me was, how was I ever going to tell anyone about it and them not think I was daft or mad or something?
Yes, and some particular mirrors are more unsympathetic than others, aren't there? I mean, I think, for instance, mirror sunglasses, that some people wear, are incredibly aggressive, aren't they? Because you look at the person, you can't see them, they keep you out, and even worse, they throw you back at yourself. And also, I must put in a word here for mirrors in changing rooms with harsh lighting, and which always somehow are just big enough in those communal changing rooms, which we females have to suffer, just to include the 16-year-old suntanned, braless, size 8 nymphet, who's trying on the dress in the background. So there's you in front and her just behind.
But how can there be good and bad mirrors? It fascinates me that when one goes to fun fairs and so forth, you have distorting mirrors. Now, there's a task, in fact, we have one in our department, a distorting mirror, and you stand in front of this mirror.
Why do you have one?
Well, I'll tell you in a moment.
Psychology.
In a tight, in a tight
They keep their
leotard.
rats and octopi.
Oh,
all
don't let him
I
run
won't
you
let
off.
him put me off, no. One stands in front of this distorting mirror, you see, and it either makes you look very thin or very fat. And what you are, you've got a button, and you can bring the mirror back into alignment. So we can actually see the extent to which you bias yourself, you bias your shape. So you find that sometimes very fat people, in fact, what they do, so do very thin people, the obese and the anorexics, overestimate their size. And they say, yes, that is the actual me. And you can measure by the degree difference actually what bias they see in the mirror.
Is it true that some people have such a firm grasp of their own identity that even when faced with mirrors which distort maximally, that they see no distortion whatsoever?
There are extreme cases like that, but it's fascinating that there is the idea of objective and non-objective mirrors, and these are mirrors which can be made objective, which people can't make objective.
How do you introduce this mirror to the client? I mean, we've got a funny mirror here.
Oh, yes,
Don't
well,
let it worry you.
it's an amusing task. I mean, it would do rather well in fun fairs, wouldn't it? You stand there, and the game is you win a coconut if you get it exactly exactly right.
Can I have a word about shaving, by the way?
But this is a consulting room you're talking about, is it? Or it's just part of the practice of teaching the subject?
It's one of the problems with people, particularly anorexic, is they will not admit or do not have any concept of the extreme thinness of their body.
I don't look in a mirror because it can't offer me anything but bad news. Laurie, who knows, he was telling us at some length, I thought earlier, that he's constantly looking in mirrors, and the only slight, what shall I say, defect he can spot is he hasn't got quite a cheerful expression as he would like. But I would say that those who deliberately don't look in mirrors, like I found myself not doing, are as narcissistic as those who do, because the motivation is the same.
I agree.
But what about shaving? I mean, when you're...
No, I don't use a mirror for shaving. I visualise the face.
That's extraordinary. It reminds me of the Ronnie Scott... It's with the Ronnie...
It's just because I've got a mirror, not a mirror, but a window in front of me. And it's
but I mean, is it that thing you used to remind me of that Ronnie Scott joke of arriving and the landlady says, have you got a good memory for faces? And he says, why? Because she says there's no shaving mirror. But I mean, but nevertheless, but every morning, you say you don't do it, but I mean, most people every morning are faced with this absurd ritual. And the ability to be able to shave, and I think that probably there's a very important difference between those people who use wet shaving and dry shaving.
Very,
if you
very
cover your face with foam
thing.
and you actually take the foam off, then every morning your face is suddenly revealed. It is seen, and I think that those people who are wet shavers are much vainer.
We must reserve the whole subject of shaving for another, because we can't ruin a topic like that.
That daily inspection of the face, that daily knowledge of the face, and the daily awareness of which part of the face will bleed when you're in a hurry, which I always believe is why announcers on breakfast television are called Nick, because they are people who don't nick themselves when they're shaving.
Very good. But can I just say that Nick would say that Narcissus is a very bad friend to the whole topic of mirrors, because of him there's come this idea that looking in the mirror is to do with vanity. Now, small children and lovely youth, it seems to me, very rarely look in the mirror. They know how good they are. That looking in the mirror is on the whole a restorative thing. It's looking at what first aid you could possibly do to this sagging complexion in front of you. I think we shouldn't associate with vanity.
Well, I only was ever in the presence once of a man who was entirely candid about looking in mirrors. It was the late film star Ray Milland. What was his name? Reg Jones in real life. But Ray Milland, splendid actor, and he was sitting there, he'd just written his autobiography, and I was interviewing him for the book programme, and in between, he caught sight of himself in the studio monitor, and entirely unaffectedly, and with an utter simplicity and a complete absence of irony, simply said, "God, I look good." And this from a man who at the time was wearing a wig. And I have to say, I thought he looked good too, but that's the only candid piece of narcissism I've ever heard, that you couldn't tamper with. Now we're going to have a song just on this theme. There's Jeremy smiling back at me through the mirror, no, the glass I should say, and he calls it The More I See Me.
The most beautiful sight I've ever seen. My mirror, my mirror. What a cutie, such an interesting masculine face. Though they're on the large size, I've a nose and two eyes, and at least they are in the right place. It's fantastic, so elastic, just enough skin yet plenty to spare. While it's smooth round my teeth, there's a bit underneath I can shave or keep covered in hair. Who is looking so delicious? Tell me who this dish is, so distingué, gazing back in admiration, just like the picture of Dorian Gray. There's my dimple and a pimple, or perhaps it's the start of a boil. Heads, I squeeze it tonight, tails, I leave it, it might go away. It's a pity to spoil. Check my profile to ensure that it's not disappeared. It's a wonderful sight when it's in the right light and the steam from the bath hasn't cleared. It's disarming, I'm Prince Charming. To the subject of me, I'm a slave. My bottom's like jelly, I've got a pot belly, but that's 'cause the mirror's concave. Since the first time I was shown this Latter-day Adonis, I had to agree. There's been, and nothing else quite like it that gave so much personal pleasure to me. It's at night time. I admit I'm bound to visually be at my least good. But when I awaken, I'm often mistaken for Harrison Ford and Clint Eastwood. Harpers and Vogue beat a path to my door. Please can we come and just look, they implore. Painted by Hockney and sculpted by Moore, the National Gallery's got at least 4. What a body, nothing shoddy. It's a triumph of art and design. Though it's several years old and they've broken the mould, I have paid for it all, and it's mine.
There was Jeremy, and I don't believe even he remembered the old joke about shaving. Someone was going to say it, I'll say it now. You know, you go into the bathroom, you've had a very thick night, you look awful, you turn into the mirror and you say, I don't know who you are, but I'm going to shave you. Most people have heard it, but all the others, you see, all the others won't have heard it. I thought it was a good joke. Well, there's a hobbies fair at Earl's Court. I doubt if any of you went, but it's there. And it occurred to me on reading that news that hobbies were a strange thing. Are hobbies what you do to make sure you're not working, or are they themselves a kind of work that if you had the chance you'd sooner do than the work you do? Or are they essentially a second-class activity, something that stays a hobby because you don't want to do it seriously? I mean, if you were very good at, say, painting watercolours, it'd stop being a hobby, wouldn't it, and start landing you with responsibilities. And I wonder, is that what defines a hobby? Something that doesn't carry responsibility, something you don't have to answer for?
I think it's just a very unfortunate word. I think it belongs to the world of mummy, daddy and dolly. It belongs to parents saying to children who've got nothing to do, go and find a hobby, and then you go out and buy a book called Favourite Hobbies and something. Now, if you call them interests, it seems to me they then become much more respectable. They are an absolutely essential part of everyone's repertoire. I think they should, by definition, be incredibly boring, and so that you then retreat into an oasis where very few can follow you. And the key, unlike the cloister, isn't a geographical, physical one. It's a cultural one. You're in an area of total obsession, and you've got a little bit of privacy.
I absolutely agree that I think a hobby is, by definition, humourless. What distinguishes a hobby from an interest or a pastime is its seriousness. And what was as a child play, and children, they keep telling us that children play in order to learn, then becomes an end in itself. And I feel the archetypal hobby is solitary, blameless, harmless, and has, alas, an end product. When I think of this hobbies fair, I think of people in Fair Isle pulleys and socks with sandals.
You're losing an awful lot of votes there.
Yes, no, I know I am, but I do find it distressingly humorless.
I think you're right, because you've got to decline the word. I think we're getting that. I think hobbies is something that social inadequates do, because they can't mix with people. They play with their toys
it's a
or
bit
whatever.
Black and white, Squire.
Well, I'm declining it. You see, I think hobbies have got to interests, and I think interests better than hobbies, and pastime better than interests, and leisure better than both. But recreation, you see, in Who's Who, you have recreation. And I think what one's supposed to do in one's hobby is they're meant to be self-improving. I think this is the important thing. And the best type of hobby is to be an amateur.
I remember interviewing somebody who came along to come to the university and saying to her halfway through the interview, I see that you've got down here that you do some brass rubbing. She said, yes. Said, what where do you do that really? Where do you go to do the brass rubbing? She said, I go to, quite a few places really. So I said, I said, have you got any particular sort of brass rubbing, any particular area that you concentrate on at all? I mean, interviews are often rather like this, and you feel that you're trying to bring. She said, I said, I don't think you've ever done any brass rubbing, have you? And she said, no, but it says hobbies, and the teacher said you could just put down brass rubbing. Now, there is the notion that really, that you have to, at some stage in your life, get a hobby. Now, now the point about it is, we were talking about it when you were saying about work. I mean, you can't have a hobby until the notion of work has been established. I mean, it's impossible for a 3-year-old to have a hobby because a 3-year-old doesn't know what work is. So after school starts, and there's a thing called homework, and there is school work, then the hobby starts off at the side of it. And it is distinguished by that. But I think that sort of really healthy people, and I don't know why we are being very nasty to hobbies, but I do think that healthy people should have stopped doing it by around about the age of 20, because what it fundamentally is seems to me to be the endless reordering of inanimate matter. That is what most hobbies do. They take bus tickets, they take matchsticks, and they put them in order. They collect them, and they order, and they categorise. Yeah. And when they grow up, they collect birds. They go down and they write down all the names of all the birds.
Well, I don't know. I call this rich. I call this...
Hobby.
No, my mother would have called this cheek. Coming from a man who a few weeks ago was telling us how he disturbed his neighbours because he was busy Marley-tining his dinette. If I've got it right. Your hobby, I was quite clear what your hobby was.
Do it yourself.
Do it yourself. But one of the things about hobbies, I do think we have to get more precise about it. We can't just blackguard people who have hobbies. I would suspect that the hobby is something you do in private. That's why I said earlier you bear no responsibility for it. That's to say you do not have to answer for it. Work is... whatever else it is where you meet the world. In your hobby, you just meet the like-minded. In a curious sort of way, work is meat and potatoes, and hobby is the pudding. And I see no reason why that shouldn't be perfectly acceptable.
That naturally assumes that you don't like your work, doesn't it? I
mean, not necessarily that you want to change, that you haven't got tunnel vision.
Well, you don't have to have tunnel vision if your work is exciting enough. I mean, I think Sir Peter Hall on the television one night said, someone asked him what his hobbies were, and he said, my work is my hobby. I get enough satisfaction out of my work. I don't need hobbies. And surely it's a way of...
for some.
Well, it's true, isn't it?
I think that's exactly what goes wrong in this sort of discussion, that somehow in a work...
Thank goodness we've got you here to bring us to heel.
oriented society, a Protestant ethic, work is the important thing. Everything else you do is trivial. Now, in fact, you can very much like your work, but as Bob says, every now and again you want a break. The brain wants to be occupied in something else. But unfortunately, because we're so work-oriented, the whole hobby business has, as I said before, been given a ridiculous name, first of all, and then been labelled with the sort of people that Sarah's talking, that man that Dick Emery used to act, who always had a Fair Isle pullover, was making scale models of Concorde or Big Ben,
which always collapsed at the end. This is racial talk about people who wear Fair Isle pullovers.
I'd like to defend the hobbyists. As I said, I think they're onto some sort of area that the rest of us are rather jealous about.
Right,
that's why we don't like
it. Would you like to go further and tell us what your hobby is? Because if ever I saw a man with a hobbyist's haircut, it's you. Now, what do you actually do? Is it building cathedrals out of matchsticks or what?
I thought you might ask this, Bob. And I was thinking how difficult it is that if you say things like reading and watching films...
You can't say
You can't, because everybody does. I then thought you have to choose something that's so demonstrably obsessional and boring, it would then count as a hobby. And the only thing I've got is a certain interest in the music hall. And I used to run something called the Music Hall Society.
You sing a few of the old ones every now and again.
I used to go to hear meetings about how mind readers in 1934 did their acts. And that seemed to me to qualify it for a hobby.
Yes,
I liked it, but it's an instant turn-off for anyone.
I wanted you to come out of the closet, Sarah.
Yes, I'm afraid, I don't know about racialists, I'm sorry about this, but I'm going to have to get sexist, because I think hobbies are for men. And Laurie, I draw on your point about it being a sort of alternative to work, because you notice most women just service men's hobbies. They make the tea and sarnies, they nip up and down the attic stairs and out to the shed and service these hobbies. But unfortunately, you see, really there does have to be this product. I do think that things like Blue Peter and Play School have a lot to answer for with their models of the post office tower made out of clothes pegs, you know, and their awful Taj Mahals made from loo-rail cylinders. Yes. And I must draw your attention to the Young Pioneer's Manual for Canada, dated circa 1910, which has the following advice. Your hobbies can make useful Christmas gifts. For father or a favourite uncle, what about a tobacco pouch? It then emerges that the favoured material for this gift is the dewlap of the bull moose. Now, this is packed with interesting and sometimes alarming assumptions. The first, of course, is a ready supply of bull moose. And
you
the
have
second,
to find someone with the hobby of killing bulls
and mice.
Absolutely,
to be relieved of their dewlaps, you know. And there's this dangerous overspill that occurs.
I'm surprised you mentioned Canada, because I thought that only the English... Only the English had hobbies. I've never... I mean, foreigners, as far as I know, don't have hobbies.
This is an English
and
book
indeed,
for people going to Canada.
Is it? I mean, indeed, you can actually, if you come across examples. I mean, somebody was... it's my turn this week, but it's not yours, Nicholas. Right? Go back to your matchsticks. But no, but if you go through... Somebody was telling me about going through past Orpington the other day. They were driving past Orpington, and they noticed there, in a particular part of Orpington, there were rows of houses, relatively new development, relatively new estate, smallish houses, medium-sized houses, but there were some enormous hangars, great aerodrome places, which were selling do-it-yourself gear, that in fact these are great temples. And the idea that all the stuff in these huge temples was gradually being moved plank by plank, bucket by bucket, down to these small houses and banged into place, struck him as an example of English lunacy.
Adrian.
But isn't that is the example of the Protestant work ethic at work? Do it yourself is exactly self-improvement, as I pointed out. This is a different form of work. What most people claim, or one of the very most common claims for people as regards their hobbies, is gardening. Now, you see, gardening, I think, is a very interesting psychology, if you like. Why do people garden? Why are there so many people in Who's Who put gardening down? And I think the answer is quite simple. It's a compensation for what they do at work. People in Who's Who are executives in one sense or another. They sit passing pieces of paper from one side of the desk to the other. They're managers, decision makers of one sort or another. But gardening offers you the opportunity of going down in your green wellies and your stockbroker Tudor house to the bottom of the garden, pottering on and getting your hands dirty.
But you sound as though you're going to tick them off for doing this.
Well, no, I'm not. What I'm trying to point out is that much of these hobbies that we claim are actually self-improving, you see. They are another form of work. They're not frivolous, they're not obsessional, but they're ways of compensating for the frustrations of work.
This seems to me like Laurie's ucker forms. So those of us who interview sixth formers will know that I saw something the other day whose hobby was visiting an old man. So I said,
that's very good.
That's very nice. He said, yes, he said, I talk to him every time I do my paper round. Now, when you get a Who's Who thing, I think this is a really interesting thing. You have this bit, not that I have, of course, but I mean, other people have this bit where they have to put their hobbies in. And having made fun of hobbies all their life, they suddenly feel guilty that they haven't got one. So what do they say?
No, they
gardening.
No,
the obvious answer.
We're off on, it's a byway, this, because people only put that in to make themselves sound a little more interesting than they deeply, profoundly feel themselves to be. You should always leave it out. But there are some people who cannot possibly imagine having a hobby. Picasso. Now, Picasso had neither a hobby nor did he have work. You can't imagine on the hobby side of things climbing under the Renault and fixing the half shaft of a Saturday afternoon. Equally, he had no work. The pictures were both hobby and work as far as it was one grand obsession.
Doesn't it illustrate my point about that?
I hope so.
It was his obsession.
I thought it was a good enough point on its own.
It illustrates my point that people who have satisfying work don't need hobbies. And that it was his passion, and that it was sufficient.
I just think that's fat-headed, if you'll forgive me, Adrian, because there must be an awful lot of people who aren't Picasso and an awful lot of people who aren't Mr. Pooter. In between, there must be people like our good selves. And who knows? There's Nicholas. He comes home after a hard day lecturing to people, just as you do, and he finds that the actual work hasn't quite scratched the itch totally. So there's a little putty he can pick up in the shape of his music hall songs and the things of bygone eras, which fills in the gap. So I think you're being just a little too absolutist, if I may say so.
Of course I am.
The hobby must be more attractive to the people participating than to anybody else. Now, I occasionally step into the twilight world of amateur dramatics, and I was mortified to be told by somebody else that this was rather a jolly hobby. I thought, hobby, how dirty, with all that passion, that
those
blood
amateurs.
flowing. But of course, it's a truism about am-jams that that there's awful well-made plays full of people called Binky and Jacko are much more enjoyed by the participants than the audience.
Do you know, I always believed...
God, it is a hobby.
Do you know, I believed at school that a hobby was like a soul. Like a Catholic school, one could never see the soul, and one could never really see hobbies, and they were always asking if you'd got one. And I can remember some poor boy who, for the rest of his time at school, was always referred to as my hobby. He was called upon, we were all called upon, to make a 1-minute talk. I mean, this is a way in which a schoolmaster with 35 boys filled up 35 minutes of time. And he said, right, 1 minute, stand up and do my hobby. And I remember he stood there and he said, my hobby... And he thought for a moment, and he went on thinking for a moment, and then after about 20 seconds, I think later we used to like to say it was a minute, after 20 seconds he simply said, furthermore, he said...
Notwithstanding.
Sarah Harrison, Nicholas Tucker, Adrian Furnham and Professor Laurie Taylor were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Jeremy Nicholas provided the musical interlude, and the programme was produced by Michael Ember.